This is FE Peer Review. The date is February the 6th, 2022. Parallel rays of sunlight. Gary Wybenga is wrong, as usual. This is a brief follow-up on the video I put out yesterday about the path of sunlight rays reaching the Earth. Gary left this little comment on that video. Sun rays from a spherical sun cannot have parallel rays. Let's take a look at that. As a reminder, this was the diagram we were looking at yesterday. And in that diagram, I pointed out something very, very specific, and I was careful in my choice of words. This green line and that red line are not parallel. Based on the particular observer locations we looked at, we determined that they were a few arc seconds divergent. However, I also very specifically described these lines as the average or sum of all the light rays reaching a specific point on the Earth, not as the only light ray or all of the light rays. It was the average or sum of all of the light rays, and that, if you sum them all up, that is the path of the average light ray reaching the point at 45 north, and that is the path of the average light ray reaching the point of 45 south. So that subtlety of language is what seems to have gone directly over the head of Mr. Wybenga. So let's take a look at this a little more closely. So we will look at a sun here, this big orangish yellowy thing. And we will say that at every point on its surface, light is being emitted in all directions, 180 degrees, a half of a sphere. Light off of this point of this sun, let me zoom in a little more. Right there, the light coming off of that is emitting photons in every direction. And the light off of this point is going off in every direction. And this point, and this point, and basically every point on the sun's surface is casting light in every direction. And all those paths, if we take this one here, that path is not parallel to that path, which is not parallel to that path, and so forth. Now, if the sun were an infinitesimal point source of light, that would be the end of the story, and it would be correct to say that the sun's rays are not parallel, ever, none of them. If we want to nitpick, we can say that the ray that's directly opposite this one, that would go off of our infinitesimal sun point this way, those two rays would be parallel. But let's not nitpick if we don't have to. However, it's all irrelevant because the sun is not an infinitesimal light source. So the example of the infinitesimal light source is irrelevant. What matters is reality. So let's take a look at the sun here, and we see that at every point on its surface, light rays are being cast in every direction. Now I'm going to zoom back out here. Scoot over. So we've determined that the average light ray reaching the two observer locations on our beautiful spheroidal planet are not parallel, that they diverge by a few arc seconds. But there are, in fact, light rays that are parallel that reach those 2 points. So here's a person at 45 north on the left side of the screen and a person at 45 south below that. The green lines represent the entire range of space from which light of the sun is reaching the point at 45 north. And within that, we have an average, which is our central green line, but we also happen to have a line there, as well as a nearly infinite number of other lines reaching this point. And it just so happens that we have the identical situation in the southern hemisphere with our average, and for good measure, a line there. And that line and that line are parallel. They are parallel rays of sunlight reaching these 2 points They're just not the average ray of sunlight for those 2 points. But they are parallel. So, Gary, you're wrong, and you're welcome to go into the comment section below and admit that you are wrong and apologize for being wrong. Well, you don't need to apologize for being wrong. You just need to admit it. And but you could apologize for a lot of the other rude things that you say in my comments while you're at it. So there you go. Sunlight's rays are parallel. Some of them, and some of them aren't. Is it really all that complicated? It is all totally irrelevant, because when you put it all together, you're talking about arc seconds. So I'm going to repeat my little message to Kyle Adams before. None of this matters. None of this matters. This is all just a diversion tactic used by people like Kyle Adams to avoid having solid, mature, rational discussions about issues. He'd rather go off on whether or not sun rays are parallel when what matters is things like, does celestial navigation work? Yes, it does. And it works based on a simplification of reality that includes considering the light reaching the earth as coming in parallel rays. But it works. So I really had enough of all of this diversionary tactic, and I really don't think that we should be permitting it anymore. We should be calling it out every time it's used. We should be saying, no, that's not relevant. Here's why it's not relevant. We're talking about arc seconds, when other factors are vastly more significant. So let's get back to the real issue at hand here. I'm really tired of their dishonesty, intellectual dishonesty, outright lies. No more of that. I'm finished with it. I'm just going to stick to reality here. Speaking of the subject of reality, there was one other interesting little comment from our favorite Gary Wybenga. Gary wrote, sun rays from a spherical sun cannot have parallel rays. I responded with, it's all about scale. Gary says, whatever you want it to be. I answered Gary on that point. Gary Wybenga, whatever you want it to be. No, Gary, it is what it is, regardless of what I want it to be. That's the difference between you and me. The difference between building one's understanding of nature on faith and a book versus on physical evidence. So now that you've seen the video, can you tell me the calculated angular size of the Earth with respect to the Sun according to the heliocentric model? It's all about scale. And that's really what it comes down to. Building one's understanding of nature on faith and a book versus on physical evidence. When we're dealing with people like Gary Wybenga and Kyle Adams, and I'll add others who are far worse, we encounter the same intellectually dishonest tactics over and over. These include things like gotcha word games, cherry-picked dictionary definitions to try to redefine things like what science means to suit their purposes. And nitpicking. We're doing a lot of nitpicking about parallel rays of sunlight. I totally don't trust why Kyle Adams spent so much time on that subject when he was talking with Mr. Sensible. I know what he's got in mind. He wants to get people to say, to agree with him, let's find common ground and agree that sun's rays are not parallel, so that when we start talking about things like celestial navigation or the Eratosthenes experiment, he can whip that out of his little tool sack and say, but you said sun rays aren't parallel. You agreed that sun rays aren't. That's the kind of mentality we're dealing with. And we just have to fight it at the front end. Call it for what it is. There's a lovely view of the Earth here, our beautiful Earth, from a different Adams. Ansel Adams, the great photographer. So when we're trying to understand the world and we're dealing with people like Kyle Adams, We have to be really fussy and annoying sometimes. I don't like to be nitpicky. I try to be careful in the use of language. It's annoying to have to constantly be thinking in the back of your mind, how is this person going to take what I've said and twist the words around to mean something I didn't intend? I have to, it's oppressive to have to think that way when you're trying to have a conversation with someone, and that's what you have to be worried about. How are they going to twist my words to mean something else? So you have to sit there and be constantly super careful about every little word you say. So what do? I say effectively parallel. I don't just say the sun's rays are parallel. I say they are effectively parallel. So that when the person comes back and says, you said the rays of the sun are parallel, and I showed they're not parallel, I could say, no, I said they are effectively parallel, which means that for our purposes, we can consider them parallel for what we're doing today. That's the kind of stuff we have to deal with when we're talking to these people. So keep that in mind. This is one of the reasons why I don't interact with them one-on-one very much, because I just have no tolerance for that kind of attitude. It's childish behavior from people who think they're adults. I mean, these people are married with kids. I pity their poor kids. But those children will grow up. And they live in a different world, so they will probably manage pretty well. Okay, enough of my ranting. Hope you all enjoyed this. You know the routine. Click the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, tell your friends, and by all means, leave a comment. Have a great day, folks.